at the University of Hertfordshire. Welcome to this second Decolonising Filmic Experience workshop, today devoted to the subject of film education. I'm Dr. James Harvey. I'm a senior lecturer in film and media here at Hertfordshire. And this is, as I say, the second workshop of what I hope will be a continuing series around this theme of decolonisation in relation to different dimensions of the filmic experience. I want to begin today by turning attention to this image that you might have noticed also being circulated with the marketing for the event as a kind of contextual frame around much of what we'll talk about today, I think. And I want to return us to this scene where we have a 14-year-old girl making her second film. This is all she knows and all she wants to know. It's what her family do. She's allowed to travel with her older sister across the border to a nation which has been recently invaded by hostile foreign powers who are claiming to free the people. Despite her youth, the girl seems to have mastered already something that is longed for by most who advocate principles of empathy and hospitality. That is a respect for difference, to recognise the gap that exists between oneself and another. Filled with a deep curiosity about the lives of others, the girl shoots through the back of her sister. She wants to take it all in, to capture not just the drama that was constructed, but the relationships emerging between all those in the production of the film. In her sister's fiction, the protagonist appears as a powerful young woman, overcoming the misogyny of her oppressive country. In the girl's film, we're given access to the artificiality of this character. She does not read her lines so easily. The reality of the present moment weighs far more heavily on her shoulders than the fiction would suggest. The scenario I'm describing derives from Hannah Macmabaf's The Joy of Madness, which is a making-of documentary showing us behind the scenes of her sister Samira Macmabaf's feature film at 5 in the afternoon. A notable landmark in recent film history as the first feature made after the NATO invasion of Afghanistan, not to mention yet another chapter in the long history of the Macmabaf cinematic dynasty. Both films are testament to, or at least an attempt to realise, a kind of sisterhood across borders. The division between the two cultures is itself a product of colonial warfare and external interests. The fiction recognises this, but unlike the documentary, it does not acknowledge its own position in these relations of power. Producing a film at a time of relative stability within a safety net of European finances at 5 in the afternoon shows no awareness of its distance from its subject. Rather, an aesthetic derived from a long history of cinematic realism is applied to a foreign situation, giving the impression that different contexts can be understood through shared means without even consideration of their peculiarities. The Joy of Madness begins instead from a position of pronounced ignorance. It frames the film's makers as mad to even attempt such a thing. Now, I've taken this detour because I think it provides a fitting backdrop to today's second workshop as we turn to the topic of decolonisation and film education. I think these two films, The Joy of Madness and At 5 in the Afternoon, and their surrounding contexts provide a fascinating 21st century example of the ways in which coloniality and cinema are entwined and the ways in which practices in de-centred learning might emerge. So I'm delighted to welcome you today to kind of step out of this scenario that I'm attempting to construct in our own minds, especially to our speakers for preparing for the hard work they've undertaken in preparing for today, particularly our keynote speaker, Professor Lindiwe Dovey, to whose work I'm personally indebted and which has been generally formative to the development of what we might call decolonial film studies today, if such a thing exists, and which I hope we'll kind of discuss a lot around today. Before handing over to Lindy Way, I wanted to open today with some more framing context. So this workshop follows a previous one, which was held last month on the subject of decolonisation in film exhibition and distribution. We were lucky to be joined by experienced practitioners working in the wider creative industries, as well as scholars of film and coloniality. Thematic panels explored attempts to interrogate the practical implications of colonial archiving practices, festivals devoted to post-colonial histories, research on alternative sites of exhibition, and collaborative work with cultural organisations to evaluate the efficacy of decolonial methods. I opened that workshop by arguing that by critically engaging with the work on decolonisation undertaking elsewhere in the arts and humanities since Rhodes Must Fall and the acceleration of anti-racist movements, including Black Lives Matter, there exists an opportunity for the full spectrum of filmic experience to develop its own discipline-specific engagement with histories of coloniality and strategies of decolonisation. Focusing specifically on the UK context, I tried to attend to the ways in which institutional mechanisms in the UK, more often than not within the film industry context related to the BFI, have paid no attention at all to the contemporary landscape of decoloniality, let alone the historical ecology of coloniality. The presentations and discussions which took place last month, particularly the keynote presentation by Tape Collective founder Isra Al-Kasi, testified to the enormity of work that is not being sufficiently platformed. The efforts of curators, programmers, exhibitors and distributors bears far greater consideration in this regard, and it is here that I think the connection with the study of film, methodologies of film pedagogy, approaches to teaching and learning is most apparent. If the design and coordination of what and how we watch is one vital aspect of film experience currently being engaged in a decolonial manner, to what extent are those trying to teach film engaged in similar activities? What shared questions might arise between those two discrete realms of experience? Considering its historical lineage, arriving within the Anglo-American Academy soon after the widespread collapse of European empires, to what extent is the formalized study of film itself indebted to anti-colonial thinking? In their introduction to the edited collection Inventing Film Studies, Lee Grieverson and Heidi Wasson identified two forces facilitating the institutionalization of film studies in the 1960s. The first is the unfolding of democratic mass education programs on an international scale, which led to the emergence of new sub- and interdisciplinary fields. The second is the development of transnational social movements circulating around May 1968, which, in Grieverson and Wasson's terms, inspired an ascendant generation of film scholars to explore the pertinence of cinema to influential concepts such as ideology and power. Written this way, the history of film studies tends to ignore both the overlaps and specificities of the anti-colonial revolutions of that era, typically subsuming them into this Eurocentric narrative of the 1960s counterculture, of anti-capitalist and anti-war protest. This is why you don't hold all your papers together in one pile, isn't it? Maybe I'll stop doing that. Okay. Outside of the Euro-American context, one wonders to what extent important writings by the likes of Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral, Kwame Nkrumah, Paulo Freire, Sukarno, Albert Memmi, Khadija Sidek, or Samsia Fake must have contributed to the thinking that circulated around the development of the discipline. If the mass educational projects of the 1960s were truly democratic, we might question how it allowed for the near erasure from the film theoretical canon of anti-colonial thinkers from the very places colonialism was perpetrated. One wonders if the same would not have happened to the likes of Glauber Rocha or Fernando Solanas had their practice not traversed the camera and the page, or to Mrinal Sen or Med Hondo had their aesthetic not been so readily translatable to European modernist sensibilities. European structuralism took the place of theoretical perspectives native to colonised geographies. This meant and means outsider analyses from the likes of Claude Lévi-Strauss and Roland Barthes are privileged in the encounter with ways of thinking and being foreign to the Euro-American classroom or cinema. In the 1980s, when such frameworks were challenged with the emergence of post-colonial studies, it was often a collective endeavour through formations such as the Subaltern Studies Group or British Cultural Studies. We began finally to inquire about the very possibility of visibility or speech in Spivak's terms or representation in Hall's terms. This was accompanied in the film studies context by the theorisation of third cinema, first by Susanna Pick and Tishome Gabriel, then by Julianne Burton, Jim Pines and Paul Williman. By the time the movement was being rethought in publications at the start of the 21st century, theorisations of anti-colonial texts appear to have been more or less subsumed into the wider topic of race and representation. Those attentive to this blending of learning around race and coloniality will recognise how this works in the service of a curriculum that wants to accommodate some difference while maintaining business as usual. Some have scathingly referred to the infamous Race Week in the film and media curriculum. This does nothing at all to correct historical absences. When we devote a whole session to the topic of race, all we are doing is telling our students, here is one way of looking at things. This mode of understanding film history belongs in the past. In a pedagogy of reparations, Usha Iyer argues for the historicisation of various turns in film studies in order to de-universalise them, this is in Iyer's terms, and clarify the material conditions and cultural specificities that undergird theoretical paradigms. Taking Iyer's points forward as a decolonial imperative for film education, we can no more have a race week than we can have a film analysis, film history, film theory, or film reception week. And we certainly cannot have one that entails a deeper consideration of the ways in which the imperial systems that underpinned colonial practices pre-existed and legitimated the epistemic foundations of figurative, racialized, anthropocentric representation. Such principles have always motivated the technological and aesthetic ambitions of cinema itself. Decolonising film education then must in turn be committed to a historical critique of the ways in which film teaching and learning has worked to propagate rather than challenge these systems. Very recently, perhaps motivated by the coordinated activities of a transnational anti-racist movement, which became pronounced during the COVID pandemic, several publications have spoken directly to contemporary decolonisation discourses within the context of Anglophone film and media studies. Works of note in this regard include Cinema Journal, Volume 57, Number 4, David Martin Jones's Cinema Against Doublethink, Olivia Landry's A Decolonising Ear, Rosalind Galt's Alluring Monsters, Jyoti Mistry and Lizzie Bischoff's Special Edition of Film Education, Transnational Screens, Volume 14, Number 1, and across a range of writings, the work of Lindy Way Dovey. We're lucky enough to have Professor Dovey in attendance today and to hear more of her work on the Screen Worlds research project. Dovey is the author of 2 books on African cinema, the second of which begins to work through approaches to curation in relation to film festivals in Africa. In more recent work, this eye for the relationship between curatorial practices and pedagogical methods becomes enlivened as a mode of decolonial praxis. As she highlights in conversation with her student, Ifeanyi Iwachi, she argues that teachers should put themselves forward in class not as experts but rather as curators with a particular positionality and lived experience that really should be foregrounded right at the beginning of the module. This is unpacked further in the very personal essay on teaching and being taught, Reflections on Decolonising Pedagogy, where both positionality and curation are further highlighted as fundamental. Every syllabus, she says, should be explicitly presented to students as a subjective selection of material not as something objective. And on the kinds of selections being made, she says that showing films to students in which filmmakers reckon with their own positionality in complex, nuanced, and poetic modes has been a wonderful means to encourage a warm and intimate atmosphere. Now, Dovey underlines then not only the importance of more diverse curricula, but rather a very practical way of rejecting the canon, of platforming difference, and of pronouncing privilege. As a straight, white British man attempting to demarcate frames of coloniality within institutionalized education systems, in a discipline which is prone to preemptively celebrating its democratic achievements, I've been really encouraged by Dovey's insights. I consider myself more forthright with where I am coming from, so as to meet learners as far as possible as equals. I really sympathise with what she's described as a heightened sense of warmth, intimacy, and openness, which results in teaching and learning in this way. Today's workshop revolves around three core themes: unsettling, revising, revisit. I've never really known how you pronounce these words with the brackets in, but I've done it to myself. So revising / revisiting, let's say, and decentering. Each of these terms is very much implicit within the kinds of claims Dovey is making. This stands in contrast to other critiques of the neoliberal university, where there is sometimes what Julia Couples has described as a nostalgia for an earlier, saner university, which is only really possible for those who enjoy white privilege and to a lesser extent male privilege, who do not see coloniality on their university campuses and would deny it even exists. To unsettle Eurocentrism in the ways Couples demands in her and Ramon Grosfogel's edited collection, the possibility of decoloniality is tied to deeper structural change. But this must be accompanied, she writes, through the unsettling of Eurocentric epistemologies. There is clearly something of this in Anuba Sarkar's and Stephen Morgan's presentations, as we shall see later this morning. In both cases, a standardized canon of work is being critiqued and confronted by an alternative in the form of writings deriving from the so-called global south. The second theme of revisiting brings together two presentations concerned with a return to material from an earlier colonial time in order to learn and to unlearn, to see anew and to reorient towards the future. That is, as I'm sure Sarah Jelani's and Eleni Liaru's presentations will demonstrate, there is something fundamentally disruptive about revisiting the past in a way that almost always speaks to a future. This is vital in the context of decoloniality. Finally, our third panel turns to the concept of decentering, a term which returns repeatedly in decolonial methodologies. Usha Iyer has argued that the work of decentering the white Western canon must permeate all curricular design, including core graduate and undergraduate courses, to the point where we no longer require a World Cinema Survey course as a separate offering. And that's something I think that will probably crop up throughout today. This overhauling of curricula surely follows into theoretical frameworks as much as the screening choices. In this sense, Macarena Gomez Barris conceives of the extractive view as a way of challenging Eurocentric theorizations of global political systems, which she claims insists on decentering ocular and Eurocentric representation through decolonial visions. It's in this vein that our final panelists, Courage Foulard and Reza Janvedadi, are concerned with questions of decentering in both textual and institutional senses. I'll close by thanking you all once again for joining us on this very hot day and for a very exciting programme of presentations. I hand over now to our keynote speaker, Professor Lindiwe Dovey, who is Professor of Film and Screen Studies at SOAS, University of London. She is a researcher, teacher, filmmaker, and film curator, and her work aims to combine film scholarship and practice in mutually enlightening ways. From 2019 to 2024, she is a principal investigator of the project African Screen Worlds, Decolonising Film and Screen Studies, which is funded by European Research Council grants. From 2023 to 25, she is a SOAS Research and Knowledge Exchange College convener and is chair of the SOAS Research Culture Committee. As a film festival founder, director and curator, Lindy Way has been instrumental in raising the profile and visibility of African film in the UK. She is the co-founder of Film Africa, for which she was also the co-director and the film programme director in 2011 and 2012. And she co-founded the Cambridge African Film Festival, which she directed and curated for many years. With colleagues, Lindy Way has also co-curated film seasons, exploring the similarities and differences between film cultures and industries in different parts of the world, such as gender agenda and mixed roots. In her scholarly work, she's combined in-depth research into the exhibition, circulation and curation of film with reflections on her own experiences of founding, directing and curating film festivals, most notably in her book Curating Africa in the Age of Film Festivals, and in articles in journals such as Screen, Cinema Journal, Scope, Jump Cut, Journal of African Cultural Studies and Feminist Africa. The title of Lindy Way's talk is Reflections on the African Screen World Project. Thank you. And welcome, Lindy Way.